So, in this episode, I'm going to explain why your brain's primary goal is to reduce uncertainty and surprise, and how this mechanism is basically running everything you do, right down to the parts of your existence that you might call your personality. And I think this is really important because everybody's brain does this. Everybody's brain scans for threat and tries to predict an outcome of a situation. This is not about whether or not you have anxiety. This is an evolutionary trait that we have generated over millions of years. And I think by understanding it, it helps to give yourself a break for showing up as you do in certain situations. And also to give you a little bit more of an appreciation for how much is going on under the hood, how much work is being done in the subconscious, and how incredibly complex the brain is as an organ. So, by the end of this episode, you'll have a clear understanding of how this mechanism for control and mitigating uncertainty drives your behavior, the ways it shows up in your life and shapes that thing you call your personality, and why uncertainty can feel really difficult to navigate, especially if you are somebody that has a low tolerance for it. And then at the very end, I will walk you through what I think you can do about it. So, just for context, your brain is a prediction machine. So when something in your life feels like it's out of your hands, like a health scare or a relationship feels off, or you're waiting on some news, or maybe you've got a big decision that you can't make, your brain doesn't want to just sit there and wait and see. Out of all the possibilities, it wants to cling on to structure, to order, and anything that is going to assure some level of certainty in the outcome. And the brain does this because ultimately it's just trying to keep you safe and functioning. It's not optimizing for truth because, of course, the brain can't know the truth of the future. So instead, it's just trying to ensure your survival. But the brain's idea of what is safe and functioning and surviving is quite rigid and narrow. And we developed this ability, like I said, for seeking certainty through millions of years of evolution, because back before we had modern society, life wasn't so complex. It was about eating, sleeping, and then reproducing. So your brain needed certainty in order to survive, in order to ensure these things were happening. You needed certainty on what that rustle in the bushes was. You needed certainty on where the resources were, where the food grew, where the water was. You needed certainty on who was your enemy within the tribe. But then if you look at how this particular mechanism has contributed to modern society and manifested everything that we call our current civilization, it's interesting. We have these massive institutions that we defer to, like education systems and universities. We have medicine, which helps us outsource our certainty around what that thing on our foot is and whether or not it will go away. You have big structures like religion that help take the uncertainty out of death and what happens on the other side of this life. And you also have things like technology and convenience, because all of these systems and structures, they give us the illusion of control in chaos that is life. But then when you travel downstream and you look at how this mechanism is showing up in the subtle ways of our lives as individuals, like on a personal and interpersonal level, I think that's where things start to get really interesting, because it's not always obvious that our fear of the unknown or our seeking of certainty doesn't always look like this frantic sort of need to grip, to control. Sometimes it looks like the way we're living our life that is quite socially acceptable. So the way that this shows up in your day-to-day life is in the systems and the structure and the order that you create around the things that you do every day, like your work, your habits, your routines. And this is the layer that I think is the most easy to mistake for self-improvement or optimization. And it is obviously a type of optimization because you are creating guardrails within your life that hopefully help to lessen the amount of chaos and reduce the variables. But I do also think that this is interesting to look at through the lens of this control mechanism, because often these routines and structures that we reach for can become self-sabotaging. So a couple of examples, your morning routine. Now, ordinarily, a morning routine is actually a great thing to have. I have one. A lot of people that I admire have a morning routine, and I think that if they were all honest with themselves, it's really just about controlling how the day feels. Because when the day feels better after meditation, exercise, an ice bath, or whatever, then more gets done. And when more gets done, then you're more likely to be able to generate more revenue or more income. And then when you have more income, essentially, you are going to be okay. And again, like, this is taking a really deep look at something that a lot of people do that I think is a really great thing. Another example, and this feels like very current, is using AI. I see a lot of people building AI workflows, and I myself have played around with building some with varying levels of success. And on several occasions, I've had to look at my dedication to building these systems with AI and question whether or not it was really just a way to mitigate the uncertainty of actually just doing the work, like getting on camera and talking. And I guess in my job, that's a very particular thing, because there is the uncertainty of how I'm going to be received when I get on camera and talk and publish my work. So designing workflows with AI around my research, whilst it looks like it's creating structure, it is also, mitigating that uncertainty of not knowing what happens when I publish my work and put it online. Another example is like walking the dog. And of course, if you have a dog, you need to walk it. But when you walk it, really what you're doing is just reducing the variable of the dog going crazy, which we know it does and it will from not getting a walk. And so again, this mechanism is not a bad one. Dogs need to be walked, but really what you're doing is not necessarily walking the dog because you love the dog. You are walking the dog because you're trying to control the future outcome of having to share a house with the dog. And maybe this is just on my mind at the moment because I am also somebody that is an entrepreneur, but ambition too. I think that people's ambition for things like income targets and follower counts and numbers is interesting to look at through the lens of this control mechanism, because we tell ourselves that it's because we have drive and we want to make something out of our lives and we want to leave some kind of legacy. But really what it is it's chasing certainty that we'll be okay. And the certainty really comes down to survival. And so when you're like hustling on all your personal channels, trying to get more followers, it's because really that gives you some level of security. It gives you some level of, at least it gives your brain a feeling that with that security, you will be okay. And again, like, this is going really deep, but it's because it is deep. And how aware of this are you and in how it plays out in your own life? Then if we travel downstream another layer, and we're downstream from our personal routines and our systems, this is where I think things get ultra confronting, right? Because what we've looked at, it doesn't just stop at your workflow or how you plan your day or how you use AI to optimize your business. It follows you into your interpersonal relationships and in how you communicate and in how you show up for people. And if you see yourself in any of the examples I'm about to give, then maybe it will also be helpful for you to notice and know why you do the things the way you do, or why you take on the roles that you take on in certain relationships. So one that's, I think, a glaringly obvious one is if you're the kind of person that always feels silence in conversation. Like, you're always the one with a story. You're somebody that has lots of questions. That's definitely me. It could look like that social habit is just because you're confident or curious, or you want to share your own life experience. And it could also be that your brain is controlling for the uncertainty of what might happen if you just didn't say anything. Another one is if you're the person in the group that always organizes or hosts things, you're kind of like the alpha, the person that always has a plan, gets everyone together. I think from the outside, this looks like leadership and it looks very generous. But I don't know, is it worth questioning if it's actually just this control mechanism that's making sure that you always have a reason to be there in the group and that you always can assure the certainty of who you are to all the other members in your social group, or maybe even your family. Another example is playing the devil's advocate. And this is one that I always have to be aware of, is if you're somebody that's always, never fully committing to a position, you're assuring that you'll never be wrong, right? So if you're in a conversation, someone says something and you have a way to see the other perspective, it can look like you're just someone who's open-minded, sure. But really what you're doing is controlling how, controlling and mitigating the uncertainty of what might happen if you were wrong, or if you had an opinion that people didn't agree with, or if you chose a side and then it turned out that you might no longer believe that side as things change. I could go on and on with other examples. You know, it's interesting because psychology will look at these particular personality traits and they all have light and shade. But really, when you peel them all back, it's just uncertainty. The brain trying to mitigate uncertainty. So again, if you've noticed yourself in any of these examples, then that's fine. I think that it's great to be able to see yourself in this light and to kind of simplify what's going on, and to also know that it's not necessarily a character flaw. It's just a part of the brain that you can't necessarily control because it's inbuilt into your subconscious. There are 3 things happening to make uncertainty feel really challenging, particularly if you are someone that has a low tolerance for it, you're a sensitive person, you've had adverse life experiences, or, you know, generally you just run like a hot, urgent, and fast-paced life. So the first thing that's happening is that your brain is more than likely going to overestimate the threat of a given situation. So if you're somebody that feels particularly intolerant to uncertainty and you're afraid of a negative outcome, your brain is going to find more evidence that that negative outcome is possible. And it does this by taking all the threats and anything that's ambiguous and putting them all in the camp of threat. So I think it's helpful to use another example here. Let's just say that you're waiting on some results from the doctor about a disease that runs in your family, and you've gotten a test to see whether or not this is something that you will end up having to deal with in your life. And your brain is going to store the data that, yes, this runs in your family in that camp of a threat. And so it's going to be running its predictions based on that information. But then it's also going to take any sort of sign that might be, you know, ambiguous or like might otherwise mean something else and put that in the category of threat just to be extra safe. So this could be like the doctor's tone, the fact that you had some weird ache in your leg many months ago that you never investigated. It's going to connect all these dots and store all of that data in threat, because it has to be binary, I guess, in order to do its predictions. And in this way, the evidence you have of a worst case scenario playing out ends up being a larger base than is actually warranted. The second thing that's happening is that you are also going to underestimate your resilience. And so you will imagine a version of yourself that won't cope with the bad news, won't be able to adjust to whatever the outcome is, and will have to live your life encumbered and devastated by the results from this medical test forever. But that version of you is not actually drawn from your actual history, because in the past, you probably have been in situations where you had to face unexpected circumstances that were not to your preference, and you've been fine. And so this version that you are imagining in the future with the outcome that you don't like, this version doesn't actually exist. In cognitive behavioral therapy, they call this magnification and minimization, where you magnify the threat and then you minimize your resources to cope with it. And they're both part of the same pattern, and they co-occur because they're produced by the same neural function, right? That is from the amygdala, which is your threat detection system, and it overpowers your prefrontal cortex, which is where your executive function and logic sits. So the third thing that I was talking about, and this is what the future version of you can actually do, and I find this really interesting and important to reflect on, is that you have a immune system within your brain that is a set of processes that will activate after difficult things happen in order to give you the resilience that you need to deal with an outcome you hadn't previously or you didn't previously preference. These processes activate and they help you adapt, they help you recover, they help you make sense of whatever's changed in your life. And so when you're sitting there in the doctor's office waiting for these your brain like goes negative test results, waiting for these test results, you will overestimate the threat, you will underestimate your ability to deal with whatever outcome happens. And you're also forgetting that you have this psychological immune system that is inbuilt into your brain to help you adapt and adjust. And all of these tests have been done by these psychologists at Harvard, where they asked people how they predicted they would feel when worst case scenarios unfolded, like breakups happened, or they lost their jobs, or they got bad news, or had major setbacks, or things go wrong with their health. And all of the participants in these studies had predicted that they would feel worse, but adaptation occurred, and they just didn't factor it in beforehand. If you're ever sitting with one of these kind of uncertain circumstances, and you're watching your brain do all these things, you're watching your brain have so much anxiety about what's before you, because you're uncertain about it, it's important to know that all these things are at play, but in the future you do also have an adaptive mechanism that will help you cope. This mechanism that you have for scanning for threat and trying to mitigate uncertainty is something that is ancient and inbuilt into your brain, and something that you cannot control. It's happening below your awareness, it's happening all the time, and it's happening to you and every single person that you know. And in fact, we should be grateful for our brains being able to do this whilst we get on with our day-to-day life. So the question that I want to leave you with is this: what would it be like to just see these mechanisms for what they really are? To be able to appreciate the brain as this incredible non-stop prediction machine that is both capable of scanning for threat and keeping us safe, whilst also helping us to adapt in situations that we weren't able to predict. If you like conversations about psychology, the self, and consciousness, then follow this channel, give me a like, drop me a comment, and hit me up on Substack. All the links are below. I share my writing and my research and more depth about the topics I'm interested in there. See you next week.